This legislation ends the flow of tax subsidies to any U.S. nonprofit that has clearly violated its tax-exempt status by providing material support to terrorist organizations. To be clear, we were here just last week to consider the same piece of legislation. This piece of legislation received unanimous approval by the Ways and Means Committee and contains provisions that already passed this House with overwhelming bipartisan support and received unanimous consent in the U.S. Senate. And yet, despite that consistent showing of bipartisan support, the majority of our Democrat colleagues voted last week to block passage of this bill. Why? Why did they block passage of this bill? Because President Trump won the election.
This sloppy bill thrown before us today contains everything condemned by the Supreme Court. The Treasury Department will be able to unilaterally affix the terrorist supporting label on a not-for-profit group without going to court, without offering any legal proof, without meeting any legal standard, and without giving the target an opportunity even to know the evidence against them. Although the Treasury Secretary must notify the group that it will be designated a terrorist supporting organization in 90 days, unless the Secretary is satisfied with the group's answer, it remains completely up to the Secretary to make a, quote, final agency determination without meeting any standard of proof. Once this scarlet letter and the infamy of being designated a terrorist supporting group are firmly affixed on the organization, the stigmatized then can finally go to a judge, but incredibly, the legal burden is explicitly put on them to prove they are not a terror supporting group, completely reversing the burden of due process which properly belongs to the government. A sixth grader would know this is unconstitutional. This is an unlawful power to vest in any president and a dangerous power to vest in a president who shows no qualms about leveling threats of retribution and revenge against his enemies.
We heard a number of fear-mongering scenarios under which they now believe the authorities in this bill might be abused. But every concern raised by Democrats has been addressed in this bill to ensure due process and to protect legitimate nonprofits. Moreover, instead of engaging in the myths we hear from the other side, we have real-world examples that show why this bill is desperately needed to end the tax-exempt status of organizations that have provided material support to terrorists. As I noted last week, we have evidence of a U.S.-based tax-exempt entity that helped fund the hiring of a so-called journalist whose real day job was working for Hamas and holding Israeli hostages in his home. There is also the U.S.-based tax-exempt organization that financially sponsors a foreign entity that the Biden Treasury Department has designated a sham charity because of its support for terrorism. And yet, both of those U.S.-based nonprofits still enjoy tax-exempt status under the Biden administration. In fact, this week, I once again called on the IRS to revoke the tax-exempt status of the organization supporting that fake charity because the Biden administration has yet to do so. In no circumstances, not one circumstance, should the U.S. taxpayer be asked to subsidize this activity by allowing such organizations to retain their tax-exempt preferential status. Unlike the made-up stories our colleagues told last week, and that they will no doubt continue to tell this week, this is the reality, and there is absolutely no excuse for it, Mr. Speaker. Congress must act to stop the abuse of our tax code that is funding terrorism around the world. We must act to end the unfair tax treatment of Americans who have already suffered enough and whose families have suffered enough from being held hostage or wrongfully detained abroad. This is the right thing to do, and I encourage my colleagues to do the right thing and support this legislation. I reserve the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the distinguished gentleman from Texas. I had a law professor who once asked the class, what are the two most beautiful words in the English language? And he said, due process. I thought the answer might be free speech, but all four of these words are ravaged and devoured by H.R. 9495, which is truly a werewolf in sheep's clothing. Look, it's a federal felony crime today to provide any material support to terrorist groups. If your not-for-profit does that, you're going to prison for at least 10 years, maybe the rest of your life. Losing your 501c3 tax-exempt status is the least of your worries. So if rendering support to terrorists is already a felony crime, then what's this all about? Well, Americans have an absolute First Amendment right to give money to support political groups that don't engage in terrorism, like the ACLU, Amnesty International, Razam for Ukraine, the International Rescue Committee. But this bill would give the new administration unilateral power to designate any of them a terrorist-supporting group and strip them of their tax-exempt status while capsizing and inverting the Constitution's guarantee of due process. In Friedman versus Maryland in 1965, the Supreme Court found that the government can only impose a prior restraint on speech, which is what this is, if there is first a judicial determination in an adversary proceeding in which the party being targeted can hear all the evidence against them, provide rebutting evidence of their own, and obtain an independent adjudication of the charge by a neutral judge. That's what due process is. The president-elect has said Special Counsel Jack Smith should be arrested. Former Congresswoman Liz Cheney, the former head of the Republican conference, should be jailed. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, should be court-martialed. You can imagine what they would do to a human rights group that dares to criticize Vladimir Putin or another of the beloved autocrats around the world. American civil society and the not-for-profit
Gentleman's
sector.
time has expired.
Could I request another minute?
Another minute. I yield another minute.
The gentleman is recognized for a minute.
American civil society and the not-for-profit sector must be protected against political censorship and government vendetta. Now, to get America to bite on this toxic sandwich, they've tucked the rotten, unconstitutional meat in with language clarifying that Americans held hostage are not subject to IRS penalties for failing to pay their taxes on time. The Senate already passed this fine legislation, and we could do that unanimously today. But instead, they want us to vote to give the president Orwellian powers and the American not-for-profit sector Kafkaesque nightmares. I voted against this bill last week. I will vote against it today and tomorrow and next week and for the next 4 years and beyond. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I yield back.